Pramāṇa literally means proof and means of knowledge. It refers to epistemology in Indian philosophies, and is one of the key, much debated fields of study in Hinduism, Buddhism and Jainism. Since ancient times, it is a theory of knowledge, and encompasses one or more reliable and valid means by which human beings gain accurate, true knowledge. The focus of Pramāṇa is how correct knowledge can be acquired, how one knows, how one doesn't, and to what extent knowledge pertinent about someone or something can be acquired. Ancient and medieval Indian texts identify 6 Pramāṇas as correct means of accurate knowledge and truths: pratyeksa, anumana, upamana, arthapati, inupalabdi and abda. Each of these are further categorized in terms of conditionality, completeness, confidence and possibility of error by each school of Indian philosophies. The various schools of Indian philosophies vary on how many of these 6 are epistemically reliable and valid means to knowledge. For example, Carvaka School of Hinduism holds that only one is a reliable source of knowledge. Buddhism holds 2 are valid means. Jainism holds 3, while Mimamsa and Advaita Vedanta schools of Hinduism hold all 6 are useful and can be reliable means to knowledge. The various schools of Indian philosophy have debated whether one of the 6 forms of Pramāṇa can be derived from other, and the relative uniqueness of each. For example, Buddhism considers Buddha and other valid persons, valid scriptures, and valid minds as indisputable, but that such testimony is a form of perception and inference. Pramāṇas. The science and study of Pramāṇas is called Nyaya. Etymology. Pramāṇa literally means proof. The word also refers to a concept and field of Indian philosophy. The concept is derived from the Sanskrit root prama, which means correct notion, true knowledge, basis, foundation, accurate notion. Thus, the concept pramāṇa implies that which is a means of acquiring prama, a certain, correct, true knowledge. Pramāṇa forms one part of a triputty of concepts, which describe the ancient Indian view on how knowledge is gained. The other 2 concepts are knower and knowable, each discussed in how they influence the knowledge, by their own characteristic and the process of knowing. The 2 are called pramata and prameya. The term pramāṇa is commonly found in various schools of Hinduism. In Buddhist literature, pramāṇa is referred to as pramanavada. Pramāṇa is also related to the Indian concept of yukti, which means active application of epistemology at what one already knows, innovation, clever expedients or connections, methodological or reasoning trick, joining together, application of contrivance, means, method, novelty or device to more efficiently achieve a purpose. Yukti and pramāṇa are discussed together in some Indian texts, with yukti described as active process of gaining knowledge in contrast to passive process of gaining knowledge through observation, perception. The texts on pramāṇa, particularly by Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa and Advaita Vedanta schools of Hinduism, include in the meaning and scope theories of errors. That is why human beings make error and reach incorrect knowledge. How can one know if one is wrong? And if so, how can one discover whether one's epistemic method was flawed, or one's conclusion was flawed? In order to revise oneself and reach correct knowledge, Hinduism identifies 6 pramāṇas as correct means of accurate knowledge and truths: pratyeksa, anumana, upamana, arthapati, inupalabdi and abda. In some texts such as by Vedvyasa, 10 pramāṇas are discussed. Krathakoti discusses 8 epistemically reliable means to correct knowledge. The most widely discussed pramāṇas are: pratyeksa means perception, It is of two types in Hindu texts, external and internal. External perception is described as that arising from the interaction of five senses and worldly objects, while internal perception is described by this school as that of inner sense, the mind. The ancient and medieval Indian texts identify four requirements for correct perception. Indriyartha sanakasa with the object, whatever is being studied, avyapadasya, avyapikara and vyavasayatmaka. Some ancient scholars proposed unusual perception as pramāṇa and called it internal perception, a proposal contested by other Indian scholars. The internal perception concepts included pratavor, samanyalaksana pratyaksa and Jainanalaksana pratyaksa. Further, some schools of Hinduism considered and refined rules of accepting uncertain knowledge from pratyaksa pranama, so as to contrast nirnaya from anadya visaya. A new manner means inference. It is described as reaching a new conclusion and truth from one or more observations and previous truths by applying reason. Observing smoke and inferring fire is an example of a new manner. In all except one Hindu philosophies, this is a valid and useful means to knowledge. The method of inference is explained by Indian texts as consisting of three parts, pratana, hetus, and drishtanta. The hypothesis must further be broken down into two parts, state the ancient Indian scholars, sadhya and paksha. The inference is conditionally true if sapiksha are present, and if vipiksha are absent. For rigor, the Indian philosophies also state further epistemic steps. For example, they demand vyapti, the requirement that the hetu must necessarily and separately account for the inference in all cases. In both sapiksha and vipiksha, a conditionally proven hypothesis is called a nigamana. Pramāṇa means comparison and analogy. Some Hindu schools consider it as a proper means of knowledge. Pramāṇa, states Dr. Fell, may be explained with the example of a traveler who has never visited lands or islands with endemic population of wildlife. He or she is told by someone who has been there that in those lands you see an animal that sort of looks like a cow, grazes like cow but is different from a cow in such and such way. Such use of analogy and comparison is, state the Indian epistemologists, a valid means of conditional knowledge, as it helps the traveler identify the new animal later. The subject of comparison is formally called upamayam. The object of comparison is called upamanam, while the attribute are identified as samanya. Thus, explains Munir Williams, if a boy says, her face is like the moon in charmingness, her face is upamayam, the moon is upamanam, and charmingness is samanya. The 7th century text Bharti Kavya in verses 10.28 through 10.63 discusses many types of comparisons and analogies, identifying when this epistemic method is more useful and reliable, and when it is not. In various ancient and medieval texts of Hinduism, 32 types of aparama and the value in epistemology are debated. Arthapati means postulation, derivation from circumstances. In contemporary logic, this pramāṇa is similar to circumstantial implication. As example, if a person left in a boat on river earlier and the time is now past the expected time of arrival, then the circumstances support the truth postulate that the person has arrived. Many Indian scholars considered this pramāṇa as invalid or at best weak, because the boat may have gotten delayed or diverted. However, in cases such as deriving the time of a future sunrise or sunset, this method was asserted by the proponents to be reliable. Another common example for arthapati in ancient Hindu texts is that if the Devadatta is fat, and the Devadatta does not eat in day, then the following must be true: the Devadatta eats in the night. This form of postulation and deriving from circumstances is, claimed the Indian scholars, a means to discovery, proper insight knowledge. The Hindu schools that accept this means of knowledge state that this method is a valid means to conditional knowledge and truths about of subject and object in original premises are different premises. The schools that do not accept this method state that postulation, extrapolation and circumstantial implication is either derivable from other Pramāṇas or flawed means to correct knowledge. Instead, one must rely on direct perception or proper inference. Anupalabdhi means non-perception, negative cognitive proof. Anupalabdhi Pramana suggests that knowing a negative, such as, there is no jug in this room, is a form of valid knowledge. If something can be observed or inferred or proven as non-existent or impossible, then one knows more than what one did without such means. In the two schools of Hinduism that consider Anupalabdhi as epistemically valuable, a valid conclusion is either sadrupa or asadrupa relation, both correct and valuable. Like other Pramāṇa, Indian scholars refined Anupalabdhi to 4 types: non-perception of the cause, non-perception of the effect, non-perception of object, and non-perception of contradiction. Only 2 schools of Hinduism accepted and developed the concept non-perception as a Pramāṇa. The schools that endorsed Anupalabdhi affirmed that it is valid and useful when the other 5 Pramāṇas fail in one's pursuit of knowledge and truth. Abhava means non-existence. Some scholars consider Anupalabdhi to be same as Abhava, while others consider Anupalabdhi and Abhava as different. Abhava Pramāṇa has been discussed in ancient Hindu texts in the context of padartha. A padartha is defined as that which is simultaneously astitva, janatva and abhidhayatva. Specific examples of padartha, states Bartley, include dravya, guna, karma, samanya, jati, samavara and vishesha. Abhava is then explained as reference of negative expression, in contrast to reference of positive expression in padartha. And absence, state the ancient scholars, is also existent, knowable and nameable, giving the example of negative numbers. Silence is a form of testimony, Asatkaryavada theory of causation, and analysis of deficit as real and valuable. Abhava was further refined in 4 types by the schools of Hinduism that accepted it as a useful method of epistemology: Damsa, Atyanta Abhava, Anyanya Abhava and Pragavaso. Abda means relying on word testimony of past to present reliable experts. Hirayana explains Sabda Pramana as a concept which means reliable expert testimony. The schools of Hinduism which consider it epistemically valid suggest that a human being needs to know numerous facts, and with the limited time and energy available, he can learn only a fraction of those facts and truths directly. He must rely on others, his parent, family, friends, teachers, ancestors and kindred members of society to rapidly acquire and share knowledge and thereby enrich each other's lives. This means of gaining proper knowledge is either spoken or written, but through sabda. The reliability of the source is important, and legitimate knowledge can only come from the sabda of reliable sources. The disagreement between the schools of Hinduism has been on how to establish reliability. Some schools, such as Carvaka, state that this is never possible, and therefore sabda is not a proper pramana. Other schools debate means to establish reliability. Different schools of Hindu philosophy accept one or more of above pramanas as valid epistemology. Carvaka School accepted only one valid source of knowledge, perception. It held all remaining methods as outright invalid or prone to error and therefore invalid. Vaisheshika School. Epistemologically, the Vaisheshika School considered the following as the only proper means of knowledge: perception, Inference, Sankhya, Yoga, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, and Advaita Vedanta schools. According to the Sankhya, Yoga, and two sub-schools of Vedanta, the proper means of knowledge must rely on these three Pramāṇas: pratyeksa, perception; anumana, inference; abda, testimony, word of reliable experts. Nyaya school. The Nyaya school accepts four means of obtaining knowledge, viz. perception, inference, comparison and word. Perception, called pratyeksa, occupies the foremost position in the Nyaya epistemology. Perception is defined by sense-object contact and is unerring. Perception can be of two types, ordinary or extraordinary. Ordinary perception is of six types, viz. visual by eyes, olfactory by nose, auditory by ears, tactile by skin, gustatory by tongue and mental by mind. Extraordinary perception is of three types, viz. Samanya Laksana, Jnana Laksana, and Yogaha. Also, there are two modes or steps in perception, viz. Nirvikalpa, when one just perceives an object without being able to know its features, and Savikalpa, when one is able to clearly know an object. All Laukika and Alaukika pratyekshas are Savikalpa. There is yet another stage called pratyabhijna, when one is able to re-recognize something on the basis of memory. Inference, called anumana, is one of the most important contributions of Nyaya. It can be of two types: inference for oneself and inference for others. Inference can also be classified into three types: purvavat, asarvit and samanyatosta. A detailed analysis of error is also given, explaining when anumana could be false. Comparison, called upamana. It is produced by the knowledge of resemblance or similarity, given some pre-description of the new object beforehand. Word, or abda, are also accepted as a pramāṇa. It can be of two types: Vaidika, which are the words of the four sacred Vedas, or can be more broadly interpreted as knowledge from sources acknowledged as authoritative, and Laukika, or words and writings of trustworthy human beings. Carvaka Mimamsa school. In Mimamsa school of Hinduism linked to Carvaka are considered the following pramāṇas as proper: pratyeksa, anumana, abda, upamana, arthapati. Advaita Vedanta and Bhatta Mimamsa schools. In Advaita Vedanta and Mimamsa school linked to Kumārila Bhatta, the following pramāṇas are accepted: pratyeksa, anumana, abda, upamana, arthapati, anupalabdhi, abhava. Buddhism. Patwakara translation group annotates that, strictly speaking, pramāṇa means valid cognition. Quote, in practice, it refers to the tradition, principally associated with Dignaga and Dharmakirti, of logic and epistemology. Buddhism accepts only two pranama as valid means to knowledge: pratyeksha and anumana. Rinpoche adds that Buddhism also considers scriptures as third valid pramāṇa, such as from Buddha and other valid minds and valid persons. This third source of valid knowledge is a form of perception and inference in Buddhist thought. Valid scriptures, valid minds and valid persons are considered in Buddhism as avasamvedan, means of cognition and knowledge, other than perception and inference, are considered invalid in Buddhism. In Buddhism, the two most important scholars of Pramāṇa are Dignaga and Dharmakirti. Sotrantrika, Dignaga and Dharmakirti are usually categorized as expounding the view of the Sotrantika tenets, though one can make a distinction between the Sotrantikas following scripture and the Sotrantikas following reason, and both these masters are described as establishing the latter. Dignaga's main text on this topic is the Pramāṇa Samuccaya. These two rejected the complex Abhidharma-based description of how in the Vaivarsika school and the Sotrantika following scripture approach, connected an external world with mental objects, and instead posited that the mental domain never connects directly with the external world but instead only perceives an aspect based upon the sense organs and the sense consciousnesses. senses. Further, the sense consciousnesses assume the form of the aspect of the external object, and what is perceived is actually the sense consciousness which has taken on the form of the external object. By starting with aspects, a logical argument about the external world as discussed by the Hindu schools was possible. Otherwise the views would be so different as to be impossible to begin a debate. Then a logical discussion could follow. This approach attempts to solve how the material world connects with the mental world, but not completely explaining it. When pushed on this point, Dharmakirti then drops a presupposition of the Sotantrika position and shifts to a kind of Yogacara position that extramental objects never really occur but arise from the habitual tendencies of mind. So he begins a debate with Hindu schools positing external objects, then later to migrate the discussion to how that is logically untenable. Note there are two differing interpretations of Dharmakirti's approach later in Tibet due to differing translations and interpretations. One is held by the Gelug school leaning to a moderate realism with some accommodation of universals, and the other held by the other schools who held that Dharmakirti was distinctly anti-realist. A key feature of Dignaga's logic is in how he treats generalities versus specific objects of knowledge. The Nyaya Hindu school made assertions about the existence of general principles, and in refutation Dignaga asserted that generalities were mere mental features and not truly existent. To do this he introduced the idea of apoa, that the way the mind recognizes is by comparing and negating known objects from the perception. In that way, the general idea or categories of objects has to do with differences from known objects, not from identification with universal truths. So one knows that a perceived chariot is a chariot not because it is in accord with a universal form of a chariot, but because it is perceived as different from things that are not chariots. This approach became an essential feature of Buddhist epistemology. Madhyamaka, the contemporary of Dignaga but before Dharmakirti, Bhava-viveka incorporated a logical approach when commenting upon Nagarjuna. He also started with a Sotantrika approach when discussing the way appearances appear, to debate with realists, but then took a middle way view of the ultimate nature of phenomenon. But he used logical assertions and arguments about the nature of that ultimate nature. His incorporation of logic into the middle way system was later critiqued by Candrakirti, who felt that the establishment of the ultimate way of abiding, since it was beyond thought and concept, was not the domain of logic. He used simple logical consequence arguments to refute the views of other tenet systems, but generally he thought a more developed use of logic and epistemology in describing the middle way was problematic. Bhava-viveka's use of autonomous logical arguments was later described as the Svatantrika approach. In Tibet, modern Buddhist schools employ the three spheres: subject, object and action. When Madhyamaka first migrated to Tibet, Antarakshita established a view of Madhyamaka more consistent with Bhava-viveka while further evolving logical assertions as a way of contemplating and developing one's viewpoint of the ultimate truth. In the 14th century, Tsongkhapa presented a new commentary and approach to Madhyamaka, which became the normative form in Tibet. In this variant, the Madhyamaka approach of Candrakirti was elevated instead of Bhava-viveka's, yet Tsongkhapa rejected Candrakirti's disdain of logic and instead incorporated logic further. The exact role of logic in Tibetan Buddhist practice and study may still be a topic of debate, but it is definitely established in the tradition. Ju Mipham remarked in his 19th century commentary on Antarakshita's Madhyamaka Lankara. Bibliography: Antarakshita, Mipham, Padmakara Translation Group. The Adornment of the Middle Way. Antarakshita's Madhyamaka Lankara with commentary by Jamgon Mipham. Boston, Massachusetts, USA, Shambhala Publications, Inc. ISBN 1-59030-2419.